So I did some pre-reads. This is going to be an interesting little session we're doing. The problem of types. I'm very tired this morning, but that's okay. In all other branches of science, it is legitimate to apply a hypothesis to an impersonal subject. Psychology, however, inescapably confronts you with the living relations between two individuals, neither of whom can be divested of his subjective personality, nor, indeed, depersonalized in any other way. Now, this reminds me, even though they're speaking of psychology and counseling and therapy and what have you, this applies to any situation, anywhere. And of course, I think about the things that have happened in the courtroom with my children, one of which was killed in a group home, and was placed in that group home through the court system. So this sentence I'm going to read again applies to any situation, anywhere, meaning attorneys, judges, people who are being tried in the courts, family courts, whatever, what have you. This sentence applies. Okay? Even though it says psychology, which isn't everything psychology when dealing with another person, however, inescapably confronts you with the living relations between two individuals, neither of whom can be derived of his subjective personality. Meaning, when an attorney is trying a case, they cannot escape their own personality and their own childhood traumas and their own deep-rooted desires. So whether they say that they're in the best interest of the client or not, they cannot escape their deep-rooted desires. I'm reading a book by Carl Jung. Let's see here. So I'm going to read that again. Psychology, however, inescapably confronts you with the living relations between two individuals, neither of whom can be divested of his subjective personality, nor indeed depersonalized in any other way. The analyst and his patient may set out by agreeing to deal with a chosen problem in an impersonal and objective manner. But once they are engaged, their whole personalities are involved in the discussion. So this happens in a courtroom. Judges, attorneys, clients, everybody's own personality gets involved. I don't care whether they're professional or not. You can't escape it. At this point, further progress is possible only if mutual agreement can be reached. Can we make any sort of objective judgment about the final result? Only if we make a comparison between our conclusions and the standards that are generally valid in the social milieu to which the individuals belong. So now they're bringing up, different backgrounds, people's backgrounds and cultures and upbringings. Even then, we must take into account the mental equilibrium or sanity of the individual concerned. For the result cannot be a completely collective leveling out of the individual to adjust him to the norms of his society. I'm going to read that sentence again too. Even then, we must take into account the mental equilibrium or sanity of the individual concerned. for the result cannot be a completely collective leveling out of the individual to adjust him to the norms of his society. This would amount to a most unnatural condition. A sane and normal society is one in which people habitually disagree, because general agreement is relatively rare outside the sphere of instinctive human qualities. Hello, everyone. I'm just reading. I can't read all the comments right now, but hello, good morning. Disagreement functions as a vehicle of mental life in society, but it is not a goal. Agreement is equally important because psychology basically depends upon balanced opposites. No judgment can be considered to be final in which its reversibility has not been taken into account. The reason for this peculiarity lies in the fact that there is no standpoint above or outside psychology that would enable us to form an ultimate judgment of what the psyche is. In spite of the fact that dreams demand individual treatment, some generalities are necessary in order to classify and clarify the material that the psychologist collects by studying many individuals. It would obviously be impossible to formulate any psychological theory or to teach it by describing large numbers of separate cases without any effort to see what they have in common and how they differ. They do that with case law. Any general characteristic can be chosen as a basis. One can, for instance, make a relatively simple distinction between individuals who have extroverted personalities and others who are introverted. This is only one of many possible generalizations, but it enables one to see immediately the difficulties that can arise if the analyst should happen to be one type and his patient the other. Since any deeper analysis of dreams leads to the confrontation of two individuals, it will obviously make a great difference whether their types of attitude are the same or not. If both belong to the same type, they may sail along happily for a long time. But if one is an extrovert, and the other an introvert, their different contradictory standpoints may clash right away, particularly when they are unaware of their own type of personality, or when they are convinced that their own is the only right type, which is always a danger. The extrovert, for instance, will choose the majority view. The introvert will reject it simply because it is fashionable. Such a misunderstanding is easy enough because the value of one is the non-value of the other. Do you see how this applies to any situation? And I'm, of course, thinking specifically of courtrooms and how judges and attorneys take advantage of people who are less advantaged. The extrovert, for instance, will choose the majority view. The introvert will reject it simply because it is fashionable. Such a misunderstanding is easy enough because the value of the one is the non-value of the other. Freud himself, for instance, interpreted the introverted type as an individual morbidly concerned with himself. But introspection and self-knowledge can just as well be of the greatest value and importance. It is vitally necessary to take account of such difference of personality in dream interpretation. It cannot be assumed that the analyst is a Superman who is above such differences. So when I read this, of course, I'm thinking of how attorneys think they know everything and that their way is the right way, and they end up, in my case, messing up my whole entire family. One child is dead and one is seriously traumatized because of the court system. It is vitally necessary to take account of such differences of personality in dream interpretation. It cannot be assumed that the analyst or attorney or judge is a superman who is above such differences just because he is a doctor who has acquired the psychological theory and a corresponding technique. He can only imagine himself to be superior insofar as he assumes that his theory and technique are absolute truths, capable of embracing the whole of the human psyche. Since such an assumption is more than doubtful, he cannot really be sure of it. Consequently, he will be assailed by secret doubts if he confronts the human wholeness of his patient with a theory or technique, which is merely a hypothesis or an attempt, instead of his own living wholeness. The analyst's whole personality is the only adequate equivalent of his patient's personality. Psychological experience and knowledge do not amount to more than mere advantages of the side of the analyst. They do not keep him outside the fray, in which he is bound to be tested just as much as his patients. Meaning, we're all human. We all have backgrounds. We all play off of those backgrounds. I don't care what position you are in the world. Politician, judge, attorney, police officer, homeless man, drug addict, we all play off of our our backgrounds. Thus, it is a matter of good deal whether their personalities are harmonious, in conflict, or complementary. Extroversion and introversion are just two among many peculiarities of human behavior, but they are often rather obvious and easily recognizable. If one studies extroverted individuals, for instance, one soon discovers that they differ in many ways from one another. And their being extroverted is therefore a superficial and too general criterion to be really characteristic. That is why, long ago, I tried to find some further basic peculiarities. Peculiarities that might serve the purpose of giving some order to the apparently limitless variations in human individuality. My favorite thing about the human beings. We're all so individual. I had always been impressed by the fact that there are a surprising number of individuals who never use their minds if they can avoid it, and an equal number who do not use their minds, who do use their minds, but in an amazingly stupid way. I'm going to read that again. I love that sentence. Isn't it so true? I had always been impressed by the fact that there are a surprising number of individuals who never use their minds if they can avoid it, and an equal number who do use their minds, but in an amazingly stupid way. I was also surprised to find many intelligent and wide-awake people who lived, as far as one could make out, as if they had never learned to use their sense organs. They did not see things before their eyes, hear the words sounding in their ears, or notice the things they touched or tasted. Some lived without being aware of the state of their own bodies. There are others who seem to live in a most curious condition of consciousness, as if the state they had arrived at today were final, with no possibility of change, or as if the world and the psyche were static and would remain so forever. They seem to be devoid of all imagination, and they entirely and exclusively depended upon their sense perception. Chances and possibilities did not exist in their world, and in today there was no real tomorrow. The future was just the repetition of the past. I am trying here to give the reader a glimpse of my own first impressions when I began to observe the many people I met. It soon became clear to me, however, that the people who used their minds were those who thought, that is, who applied their intellectual faculty in trying to adapt themselves to people and circumstances. And the equally intelligent people who did not think were those who sought and fought their way by feeling. Feeling is a word that needs some explanation. For instance, one speaks of feeling when the matter is a sentiment, corresponding to the French term sentiment. But one also applies the same word to define an opinion. For example, a communication from the White House may begin, "The president feels." Furthermore, the word may be used to express an intuition. "I had a feeling as if." When I used the word feeling in contrast to thinking, I refer to a judgment of value. For instance, agreeable or disagreeable, good or bad, and so on. Feeling, according to this definition, is not an emotion, which, as the word conveys, is involuntary. Feeling, as I mean it is, like thinking, a rational function, whereas intuition is an irrational perceiving function. Insofar as intuition is a hunch, it is not the product of a voluntary act. It is rather an involuntary event, which depends upon the different external or internal circumstances, instead of an act of judgment. Intuition is more like a sense perception, which is also an irrational event insofar as it depends essentially upon objective stimuli, which owe their existence to physical and not to mental cues. The four functional types correspond to the obvious means by which consciousness obtains its orientation to experience. The four functional types correspond to the obvious means by which consciousness obtains its orientation to experience. Sensation, i.e., sense perception, tells you that something exists. Thinking tells you what it is. Feeling tells you whether it's agreeable or not. And intuition tells you whence it comes and where it's going. The reader should understand that these four criteria of types of human behavior are just four viewpoints among many others, like willpower, temperament, imagination, memory, and so on. There is nothing dogmatic about them, but their basic nature recommends them as suitable criteria for classification. I find them particularly helpful when I am called upon to explain parents to children and husbands to wives and vice versa. They are also useful in understanding one's own prejudices. Thus, if you want to understand another person's dream, you have to sacrifice your own prejudices and suppress your own prejudices. This is not easy or comfortable because it means a moral effort that is not in everyone's taste. But if the analyst does not make the effort to criticize his own standpoint, and this applies across all relationships, in order to understand the other person's point of view, you have to let go of your point of view first to be able to understand where the other person is coming from. Thus, if you want to understand another person's dream, you have to sacrifice your own prejudices, your own predilections, and suppress your own prejudices. This is not easy or comfortable because it means a moral effort that is not to everyone's taste. But if the analyst does not make the effort to criticize his own standpoint and to admit its relativity, he will get neither the right information about nor sufficient insight into the patient's mind. The analyst expects at least a certain willingness on the patient's part to listen to his opinion and to take it seriously, and the patient must be granted the same right. Although such a relationship is indispensable for any understanding and is therefore of self-evident necessity, one must remind oneself again and again that it is more important in therapy for the patient to understand than for the analyst's theoretical expectations to be satisfied. The patient's resistance to the analyst's interpretations is not necessarily wrong. It is rather a sure sign that something does not click. Either the patient has not yet reached the point where he understands, or the interpretation does not fit. In our efforts to interpret the dream symbols of another person, we are almost invariably hampered by our tendency to fill in the unavoidable gaps in our understandings by projections, that is, by the assumption that what the analyst perceives or thinks is equally perceived or thought by the dreamer. To overcome this source of error, I have always insisted on the importance of sticking to the context of a particular dream, including all theoretical assumptions about dreams in general, except for the hypothesis that dreams in some way make sense. It will be clear from all I have said that we cannot lay down general rules for interpreting dreams. When I suggested earlier that the overall function of dreams seems to be to compensate for deficiencies or distortions in the conscious mind, I meant that this assumption opened up to the most promising approach to the nature of particular dreams. In some cases, you can see this function plainly demonstrated. One of my patients had a very high opinion of himself, and he was unaware that almost everyone who knew him was irritated by his air of moral superiority. He came to me with a dream in which he had seen a drunken tramp rolling in a ditch, a sight that evoked from him only the patronizing comment, "It's terrible to see how low a man can fall." It was evident that the unpleasant nature of the dream was at least in part an attempt to offset his inflated opinion of his own merit. But there was something more to it than this. It turned out that he had a brother who was a degenerate alcoholic. What the dream also revealed was that his superior attitude was compensating the brother, both as an outer and inner figure. In another case I recall, a woman who was proud of her intelligent understanding of psychology had reoccurring dreams about another woman. When in ordinary life she met this woman, she did not like her, thinking her a vain and dishonest intriguer. But in the dreams, the woman appeared almost as a sister, friendly and likable. My patient could not understand why she should dream so favorably about a person she disliked. But these dreams were trying to convey the idea that she herself was shadowed by an unconscious character that resembled the other woman. It was hard for my patient, who had very clear ideas about her own personality, to realize that the dream was telling her about her own power complex and her hidden motivations, unconscious influences that had more than once led to disagreeable rows with her friends. She had always blamed others for these, not herself. It is not merely the shadow side of our personalities that we overlook, disregard, and repress. We also do the same to our positive qualities. An example that comes to mind is that of an apparently modest and self-effacing man with charming manners. He always seemed content with a back seat, but discreetly insisted on being present. When asked to speak, he would offer a well-informed opinion, though he never intruded it. But he sometimes hinted that given matter could be dealt with in a far superior way at a certain higher level, though he never explained how. In his dreams, however, he constantly had encounters with the historical figures such as Napoleon and Alexander the Great. These dreams were clearly compensating for an inferiority complex. But they had another implication. What sort of man must I be, the dream was asking, to have illustrious callers? In this respect, the dream pointed to the secret megalomania, which offers the dreamer's feeling of inferiority. This unconscious idea of grandeur insulated him from the reality of his environment, enabled him to remain aloof from obligations that would be imperative for other people. He felt no need to prove, either to himself or to others, that his superior judgment was based on superior merit. He was, in fact, unconsciously playing an insane game, and the dreams were seeking to bring it to the level of consciousness in a curiously ambiguous way. Hobnobbing with Napoleon and being on speaking terms with Alexander the Great are exactly the kind of fantasies produced by an inferiority complex. But why, one asks, could not the dream be open and direct about it and say what it had to say without ambiguity? I have frequently been asked this question, and I have asked it myself. I am often surprised at the tantalizing way dreams seem to evade definite information or omit the decisive point. Freud assumed the existence of a special function of the psyche, which he called the censor. This, he supposed, twisted the dream images and made them unrecognizable or misleading in order to deceive the dreaming consciousness about the real subject of the dream. By concealing the critical thought from the dreamer, the censor protected his sleep against the shock of a disagreeable remnants. But I am skeptical about the theory that the dream is a guardian of sleep. Dreams, just as often, disturb sleep. It rather looks as if the approach to consciousness has a blotting out effect upon the subliminal contents of the psyche. The subliminal state retains ideas and images at a much lower level of tension than they possess in consciousness. In the subliminal condition, they lose clarity of definition, and relations between them are less consequential and more vaguely analogous, less rational, and therefore more incomprehensible. This can also be observed in all dreamlike conditions, whether due to fatigue, fever, or toxins. But if something happens to endow any of these images with greater tension, they become less subliminal and, as they come close to the threshold of consciousness, more sharply defined. It is from this fact that one must understand why dreams often express themselves as analogies, why one dream image slides into another, and why neither the logic nor the time scale of our waking life seem to apply. The form that dreams take is natural to the unconscious, because the material from which they are produced is retained in the subliminal state in precisely this fashion. Dreams do not guard sleep from what Freud called the incompatible wish. What he called disguise is actually the shape all impulses naturally take in the unconscious. Thus, a dream cannot produce a definite thought. If it begins to do so, it ceases to be a dream because it crosses the threshold of consciousness. That is why dreams seem to skip the very points that are most important to the conscious mind, and seem rather to manifest the fringe of consciousness, like the faint gleam of stars during a total eclipse of the sun. We should understand that dream symbols are for the most part manifestations of the psyche and is beyond the control of the conscious mind. Meaning and purposefulness are not the prerogatives of the mind. They operate in the whole of living nature. There is no difference in principle between organic and psychic growth. As a plant produces its flower, so the psyche creates its symbols. Every dream is evidence of this process. So by means of dreams, plus all sorts of intuitions, impulses, and other spontaneous events, instinctive forces influence the activity of consciousness. Instinctive forces influence the activity of consciousness. Whether that influence is for better or for worse depends upon the actual contents of the unconscious. If it contains too many things that normally ought to be conscious, then its function becomes twisted and prejudiced. Motives appear that are not based upon true instincts, but that owe their existence and psychic importance to the fact that they have been consigned to the unconscious by repression or neglect. They overlay, as it were, the normal unconscious psyche and distort its natural tendency to express basic symbols and motifs. Therefore, it is reasonable for a psychoanalyst concerned with the cause of a mental disturbance to begin by eliciting from his patient a more or less voluntary confession and realization of everything that the patient dislikes or fears. This is like the much older confession of the Church, which in many ways anticipated modern psychological techniques. Isn't that interesting? That damn church again. Here comes the church again, anticipating modern psychological techniques, dark psychology. At least this is the general rule. In practice, however, it may work the other way around. Overpowering feelings of inferiority or serious weakness may make it very difficult, even impossible, for the patient to face fresh evidence of his own inadequacy. So I have often found it profitable to begin by giving a positive outlook to the patient. This provides a helpful sense of security when he approaches the more painful insights. Take an example of a dream of personal exaltation, in which, for instance, one has tea with the Queen of England, or finds oneself on intimate terms with the Pope. If the dreamer is not schizophrenic, the practical interpretation of the symbol depends very much upon his present state of mind, that is, the condition of his ego. If the dreamer overestimates his own value, it is easy to show, from the material produced by the association of ideas, how inappropriate and childish the dreamer's intentions are, and how much they emanate from childish wishes to be equal to or superior to his parents. But if it is a case of inferiority, where an all-pervading feeling of worthlessness has already overcome every positive aspect of the dreamer's personality, it would be quite wrong to depress him still more by showing how infantile, ridiculous, or even perverse he is. That would cruelly increase his inferiority, as well as cause an unwelcome and quite unnecessary resistance to the treatment. And there are people in this world who do that shit on purpose. Find out what you're insecure about and use it to trigger you. Hateful people. There is no therapeutic technique or doctrine that is of general application. There is no therapeutic technique or doctrine that is of general application, since every case that one receives for treatment is an individual in specific condition. I remember a patient I once had to treat over a period of 9 years. I saw him only for a few weeks each year, since he lived abroad. From the start, I knew what his real trouble was, but I also saw that the least attempt to get close to the truth was met by a violent defensive reaction that threatened a complete rupture between us. Whether I liked it or not, I had to do my best to maintain our relation and to follow his inclination, which was supported by his dreams and which led our discussion away from the root of his neurosis. We ranged so wide that I often accused myself of leading my patient astray. Nothing but the fact that his condition slowly but clearly improved prevented me from confronting him brutally with the truth. Now, when I mentioned how there are people out in the world who trigger each other, so like defending attorneys who go at you, I've only been in family court, but it's just as brutal, I'm sure, as criminal court. It's just a freaking terrible game. I've had the attorneys of my daughter's father's attorney attacking my insecurities in order to gain control over the courtroom. It had nothing to do with my daughter. Absolutely nothing to do with my daughter or my son who was killed. I mean, I just have no respect for the court system at all. Let's see here. In the 10th year, however, the patient declared himself to be cured and freed from all his symptoms. I was surprised because theoretically his condition was incurable. So that's why it's so important to know yourself and know what your triggers are and know your own self so much, because people are going to be nice to you in order to get what they want, and they're going to be mean to you and degrade you in order to get what they want. There's very rare a person who genuinely is concerned about your welfare. Most people are looking for something to gain by being in communication with you. It's sad. Noticing my astonishment, he smiled and said, in effect, "And I want to thank you above all for your unfailing tact and patience in helping me to circumvent the painful cause of my neurosis. I am now ready to tell you everything about it. If I had been able to talk freely about it, I would have told you what it was at my first consultation, but that would have destroyed my rapport with you. Where should I have been then? I should have been morally bankrupt. In the course of 10 years, I have learned to trust you, and as my confidence grew, my condition improved. As my confidence grew, my condition improved." It reminds me of a card a friend once sent me that said, and the apple, I think it was the cherry blossom tree, said, "Sister, speak to me of love," and it bloomed. Something like that. I improved because this slow process restored my belief in myself. Now I am strong enough to discuss the problem that was destroying me. He then made a devastatingly frank confession of his problem, which showed me the reasons for the peculiar course our treatment had to follow. The original shock had been such that alone he had been unable to face it. He needed the help of another, and the therapeutic task was the slow establishment of confidence rather than demonstration of a clinical theory. From cases like this, I learned to adapt my methods to the needs of the individual patient. Rather than commit myself to general theoretical conditions that might be inapplicable in my particular case. The knowledge of human nature that I have accumulated in the course of 60 years of practical experience has taught me to consider each case as a new one in which, first of all, I have had to seek the individual approach. Sometimes I have not hesitated to plunge into a careful study of infantile events and fantasies, and other times I have begun at the top, even if this has meant soaring straight into the most remote metaphysical speculations. It all depends on learning the language of the individual patient and following the groupings of his unconscious toward the light. Some cases demand one method and some another. This is especially true when one seeks to interpret symbols. Two different individuals may have almost exactly the same dream. This, as one soon discovers in clinical experience, is less uncommon than the layman may think. Yet if, for instance, one dreamer is young and the other is old, the problem that disturbs them is correspondingly different and would be obviously absurd to interpret both dreams in the same way. An example that comes to my mind is a dream in which a group of young men are riding on a horseback across a wide field. The dreamer is in the lead and he jumps a ditch full of water, just clearing this hazard. The rest of the party fall into the ditch. Now, the young man who first told me this dream was a cautious, introverted type, but I also heard the same dream from an old man of daring character who had lived an active and enterprising life. At the time he had this dream, he was an invalid who gave his doctor and nurse a great deal of trouble. He had actually injured himself by his disobedience of medical instruction. It was clear to me that this dream was telling the young man what he ought to do, but it was telling the old man that what he was actually still doing. While it encouraged the hesitant young man, the old man was in such need of encouragement. The spirit of enterprise that still flickered within him was indeed his greatest trouble. This example shows how the interpretation of dreams and symbols largely depend on the individual circumstances of the dreamer and the condition of his mind. So that's it for today. Tomorrow I'm going to read the archetype and dream symbolism. And I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to read everyone's notes. Can you say happy birthday to your friend? Happy birthday. Okay, anyway, hello everyone. Thanks for tuning in and tuning out. Have a great day. It's Friday, right? Have a good Friday.